This is going to be a video on how to assemble my rubber band shooter drone. These are all the parts you'll need for the analog 2-inch version. I'll put some more links to all these parts in the description. There's multiple ways that you can do this. In my earlier test videos, I showed a nano version that's running analog on a 45mm frame, and a DJI O4 version that's running 2-inch props on 80mm frame. This video is going to be showing you how to make a 2-inch version, but on analog setup. The reason I chose this specifically is because I think it's going to be the most common, and it's going to fly the best. First is the camera. I'm going to be using the C02 camera. I decided to just remove the original wiring and run entirely new wires, but you can just splice on additional wires to it to extend it, because it's not going to reach down to the flight controller by default. The wires are on. Now to tin the other end of the wire. Now let's apply some flux onto the flight controller and tin those pads. I'm reusing a flight controller, so that's why some of the pads are already prepped. White or yellow should go to cam. Black is to ground. And red is 5V. That's about how much slack you need in order to run the motors. I'm going to be direct soldering the motors, but if you purchase these motors and this flight controller separate, and you honestly don't need to do that, and it's a lot more hassle. Because this flight controller, the Matrix 5-in-1, it actually comes with motor plugs on it, so you could just leave that and it'll be fine. I had already removed the motor plugs, and I just have no choice but to direct solder everything. If you plan to do this on the Nano build, then you're gonna need to direct solder the motors, and for that I recommend getting the AR 5-in-1 flight controller instead of the Matrix, because the AR 5-in-1 is a bit lighter. Now we're gonna start prepping the pads for the servo. I already made another video on how to set up the servo, so look up that in my channel. That's how much slack you need for the servo. Red goes to 5V, brown or black goes to ground. And yellow, or whatever is left, is going to go to the LED pad. We're going to be repurposing the LED pad to act as a servo. Some of you guys also asked about using a motor pad to drive the servo. I haven't been able to find any good documentation on how to do this. These smaller flight controllers might not have that functionality. Any of you are able to get that to work, then feel free to mention in the comments. I also strongly recommend cleaning off all the excess flux on your flight controller, because that can just attract a lot of dirt and debris, and it can actually cause the flight controller to short out unexpectedly. I'm using my rework gun, but you could also use a heat gun and just heat up the flux a little bit to reactivate it, and that'll make it easier to clean up. Another good reason why you should clean your flight controller off is then you could double check for joined pads or shorts or anything like that. It's much harder to see while there's flux all over the board. That's what I'm doing with the tweezers, just making sure everything is, independent, nothing is shorted, nothing is bridged. Now that we're done setting up all the electronics, we're going to start setting up the frame. I am going to be using the 2-inch frame. This drone uses 2 different sizes of spacers. The thicker spacers go on the sides, and the thinner ones go on top of the battery sling. Now we're going to put on the battery sling, and then we're going to put the thinner spacer on top of that. That'll keep the flight controller nice and leveled, and there won't be any additional stress on it. These spacers also help to separate it from the frame and prevent vibrations. The battery slings aren't set up in a symmetric manner. Both of them are facing the back of the frame. And it's like that for a reason. They both have a little flap on them, and that little flap prevents the battery from contacting the screw should the screw ever come loose. Because the way this frame is set up, the battery is directly above the screw. So you don't want that to ever come loose and strike the battery. I'm just going to use one screw just to hold each motor in place while I continue to screw everything else down. Put the power cable through the frame. Now there's these additional thicker spacers that isolate the mounts from the flight controller. That way the mount isn't rubbing against any of the connectors for the flight controller. And if you're running a DJI setup, then that will also help to isolate the frame from the flight controller. Now we're just plugging in the antenna, and we're going to run that through the mount for the gun itself. I also like to use that little pad to help prevent the mount from colliding with the flight controller should you ever crash. But that's optional, you don't have to do that. These are the screws that I'm using to go through the frame and the mounts. If you're using DJI, then that's what you need. If you're using analog, then that is what you need. Now we're just going to tighten those nuts down onto the screws. These are actually plastic nuts, and it doesn't really matter which one you use. I just wanted to use plastic because it's lighter. Just wrap the receiver antenna around the frame. This part is a little bit challenging. This is the servo horn, and I embedded this into a gear. So basically what you want to do is take the servo horn, the one that has two ends on it, cut them slightly, and then push them through the TPU mount for the gear. Once you assemble this, then you'll have to cut the gear off to get the servo horn out, which is why I left it as is. And you'll be reusing the screw that comes with the servo. I had to reuse the servo horn because the servo horn actually has some threading on it that prevents it from sliding when it's installed on the servo. I tried making the gear entirely out of TPU, and over time the TPU would just expand and the whole thing would start to slide and jam and fail. Now let's install the camera onto the camera holder. If you're using DJI, then you use your DJI equivalent. Now we're going to be building the barrel. These pegs for the barrel are actually the exact same diameter as a standard filament, 1.75 millimeters. So if for whatever reason you're using rubber bands that don't work with this setup, then you could just cut your own pegs and it should work fine. If your tolerances are a bit off, then you can use glue to glue the pegs in place. Also, when you're installing the pegs, these don't go straight into the barrel. They're at a bit of an angle, as you can see. So don't try to force them straight in, just do them at an angle to the side. Next, we're going to be installing the TPU gear that fits into the barrel. Just line those holes up, and then you could use some tapered screws to install that in. Those are basically acting as set screws. These screws are also about 1.75 millimeters. So if you don't have these particular screws, then you could also just jam some filament in there and that should work as well. You might have to glue it in just to help with tolerances, but it will work. See, that screw is almost exactly 1.75 millimeters. And now that's the main mount for the rubber band shooter itself. Line those holes up. And then I'm going to be using some 2M plastic screws to hold it together. We're going to be using plastic screws and plastic nuts. That's how long the screws need to be. And we're going to be using plastic nuts to help save weight. Next, we're going to be installing the claw and the spring. This does two things. This launches the rubber bands off, and it holds the barrel in place so that it doesn't rotate around on its own. Keep in mind this TPU claw uses two different types of screws. One screw is about 12 millimeters, one screw is about 9. Now we're going to install the servo itself. We're going to be using self-tapping screws. These screws are about 1.5 millimeters in diameter and around 6 millimeters in length. Keep in mind you have a bit more leeway with these screws than you do with the other ones, since they just kind of poke out and they aren't really interfering with anything, so they can be a little bit longer if you need. But they do need to be about 1.5 millimeters thick. When you install the servo into the mount, you want to double check and make sure that it's not wiggling around. If it's loose or if it's not positioned correctly, then it's going to directly interfere with the functioning of the gears. They're going to slip, they're not going to grab correctly, and it'll just cause the gun to just not fire correctly. Now I'm going to be using the main screw that holds the assembly onto the frame. Here's the dimensions for the main screw. This screw is also plastic, just like the other ones. Put the screw through and then put the larger spacer onto it. This will help prevent the assembly from rotating around from vibrations. If you don't use that washer, then it's plastic on plastic and it's just going to rotate around. Then you get horrible jello. Tighten that down. Now we're going to be installing the analog camera. The process is the same for the DJI camera, but the mount is just different. Now we're just going to tie down all those loose wires, make sure they don't get in the way of the props. Make sure your props spin and they don't collide with anything. Now we're going to install the barrel. Just snap that into place and you're done. That's how you go about installing the battery. It does take a little bit of force for the first time you install it. If you find that it's unusually difficult, then just leave it installed like that overnight, and that'll help stretch the TPU out, and it'll kind of retain that shape and be easier to install the next time. Alright, now for some troubleshooting steps. You need to be very careful with the thickness of these gears. If they're too thin, then they'll just bend and they won't grab. But if they're too thick or malformed, then they'll just skip. It should be about 2 millimeters in length and 1 millimeter in thickness. You need to make sure that your printer gets the dimensions correct. But the biggest issue you'll face with troubleshooting is probably going to be this piece right here. This little notch right here is going to be pressing against the barrel, and that holds it in place and prevents it from shifting. If that's not printed correctly, then what will happen is the servo will turn, and then it'll turn back in the other direction. And it won't, instead of continuously feeding like a ratchet mechanism should, it'll just rotate forward, rotate back. If you run into that issue, then increase the horizontal expansion for this piece, and that will make it a little bit thicker. Increase it in increments of 0.05 until you get the correct thickness. Here's how you install the barrel. Install at an angle. Make sure that the claw doesn't go in between the rubber band, otherwise it won't fire correctly. And just wiggle it a little bit and push in, and it should go. Then just pull that around and clip it in place, and it's good. You're going to want to install the barrel after you power the drone up. Otherwise, what's going to happen is this. See how the servo initialized and immediately shot one rubber band? That's what's going to happen if the barrel is installed when you power the drone up. Here's what I like about the analog version. This combination of motors and props is very efficient. Look how much power it's using just to hover. That's really low. That's actually lower than a DJI O4 Meteor 75 Pro. The Meteor 75 Pro uses like 5 amps just to hover at 40%. Now you should watch the video I made for setting up the servo. Also, if you downloaded the file prior to this video, then download it again. I made some updates and added some files that were missing.